Welcome to the Medical Mnemonist podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each episode, take a journey into the top techniques for medical mnemonics, study skills, board exam tips, and accelerated learning in higher education. Now, here's your host, Chase DiMarco.
So on today's show, we have Dr. Alex Mullen and Dr. Cathy Chen.
So we aren't done yet, actually.
If only.
Yeah, so we're in our fourth year right now.
Okay, I thought you were completed in...
We're almost there.
Yeah.
We're almost there. We will graduate in May, so...
So a little bit about you two. Alex, it looks like you went to Johns Hopkins and graduated with a degree in biomedical engineering and applied mathematics and statistics. Cathy from Princeton with degrees in chemical and biological engineering. And if I'm not mistaken, you also interned at Johns Hopkins. Is that correct?
I spent a summer there doing research, yes.
Quite a resume building up already. You both attended University of Mississippi School of Medicine and co-founders of Mullen Memory, which is a large part of what this discussion will be about today. How did that begin?
Yeah, so it really kind of started with memory competition. So we're both not people who have any kind of special memories at all. I just came across a memory book that was about memory techniques and competitions when I was in college. So I picked it up when I was a junior in college, doing biomedical engineering, like you said. And I just wanted to improve my memory for school. I felt like I didn't really have a good memory, and it was kind of an intriguing thing to me. I was, reading about all these things people could do, and I was just like, this can't be possible. Like there's got to be some sort of catch or something. But I got into it because of that book. It's called Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer, and I wanted to use the techniques for school. Like I said, I didn't really want to get into competitions, but I eventually did, just because I started to practice the techniques and kind of, fell in love with it and wanted to keep getting better and improve. And eventually found myself competing in a competition. My first competition was the 2014 USA Memory Championship. And so, I kind of got hooked on the competition side of things and started competing. And I didn't really use it a whole lot for school, actually, funnily enough, because, part of it was, my courses were mostly engineering. And so they were more kind of math and conceptual based, and it was a little bit harder to apply memory techniques there. And then part of it was just I hadn't really figured out a good way to really apply it to school just yet. And so it really wasn't until medical school that Cathy and I both kind of sat down. We had talked about the techniques a lot, obviously, and we kind of sat down and started to really, figure out a way that we could apply memory techniques to medical school, knowing that medical school is very, memorization heavy, a lot of information you have to take in and remember. So we really, kind of hunkered down at the beginning of medical school, trying to figure out what to do with these memory techniques. And so that's kind of really where the website Mullen Memory was born, is we were trying to figure out, how to do this effectively. And we hit a lot of roadblocks. We struggled, but eventually we kind of got to a point where we felt like the memory techniques were pretty effective. And so we wanted to kind of share that experience with other people learning medicine, and hopefully that could help them. And so that's kind of how the whole website was born.
Great. It's actually something that I've kind of run across so far. It seems to be very difficult to find medically specific training for these memory techniques, and really hoping to delve in a little bit more about your experiences with those and maybe some tricks for other students to follow. That was actually something I left out of your initial interview. Alex, you're also a 3-time world memory champion. You have 7 memory world records, if I'm not mistaken. So you've been at this for quite a while now, have quite a bit of experience.
Yeah, so I have been at it for a while. So I mentioned, that I got into it when I was a junior in college. I think that was in 2013. So it's been about 5.5 years now or so that I've kind of competed. My last competition was the 2017 World Championship, so I haven't competed in about a year. But yeah, I've been in it for a long time. It's been a very whirlwind experience. A lot of experiences that I never expected to have. After doing that first competition, I started to travel a lot and go around the world, and got to compete in places like China and Singapore and Indonesia, London, and just it was really kind of crazy. I never expected to do any of those things. Even got to be on a few TV shows, like one of them is called Superhuman on Fox. I got to meet Mike Tyson on that TV show. He was one of the judges. So just, a lot of really kind of weird stuff that I never expected to do.
I was just watching the preview for that the other day. It looked very interesting.
It was very, very dramatic.
It was.
And Cathy, I actually don't know as much about how you got into this and your history with it. Was it through meeting Alex, or were you interested in memory techniques prior to?
Yeah. So, well, I've known Alex for a long time. So Alex and I went to preschool together.
Yeah.
So I don't really know like what my frame of mind was before then. But Alex and I have been together since high school. So, I was around when he first picked up the book his junior year in college. So I don't think at the time we really knew what a big deal it was going to be for him. So I just kind of in the background, that's great, like cool book, and then he started competing and I've just kind of been hanging out, tagging along all along. But I think, once he started to win competitions with these memory techniques, that's when around the time we were starting med school, we were like, hey, like these techniques are really incredible. Like they work for you and your memory's not great at all. So there seems like there's probably some sort of application for med students. So that's kind of how I've been involved. I haven't really competed. I don't plan on competing, but I do enjoy using the same techniques, in school, and I find them very useful.
Okay. I feel like I should have known that part of your history together. I
No, that's
apologize.
okay. I don't think we really talk about it.
Yeah.
So what was med school like using these techniques? Do you feel it was very beneficial or just on certain topics?
Yeah. So I, kind of going back, I mentioned that it was kind of difficult for us at first and we ran into a lot of roadblocks. So I would say that, we pretty much started to try to use the techniques right out of the gate during our first year, our M1 year, and kind of struggled with it. I used it on biochem a little bit, tried to use it on anatomy. And I wasn't quite getting the results that I wanted to. I would create some sort of palace and, a couple, days or a week or two later, I'd come back and kind of the images were, not really still there and I was forgetting things. And basically, it wasn't working too well. And so it took us a little bit of time to kind of figure out how to actually use them effectively. So it probably wasn't until the end of the first year, getting towards the end of the first year, that we felt like we kind of hit our stride with the techniques. And I can kind of go over, what it was like to clear some of those roadblocks. But basically, yeah, towards the end of the first year, we kind of got the techniques, down to a point where we thought they were pretty effective. And then from then on out, I think we used them pretty effectively throughout the second year, and especially leading up to preparation for the step 1 exam, the USMLE exam. And then, have been kind of using both memory techniques, throughout the last, year and a half or so as clinical med students, but then also, just kind of branching out more into general learning strategies that have been shown to be effective from research. And so we kind of, combined that and Mullen memory sort of become, its birth was really based on memory techniques, but it's kind of become more of a general learning website. That's just kind of how it organically sort of developed with a focus on memory techniques, but also kind of looking at lots of other general learning strategies that have seen support in the literature. So
I will say, I think like one way these memory techniques have really influenced our med school experience is Alex and I took a gap year between our second and third years of med school, and we really didn't touch our textbooks or our notes too much during the year. I mean, we did review a little bit, but not too much. And I think the ease with which we were able to transition back to our clinical studies is, I think, honestly, for me, I think definitely in part due to the effort we took to make good memory palaces and really study well.
Yeah, agreed. I think we definitely had an easier time transitioning back into med school after that year off than we otherwise would have.
Mm-hmm.
I think going into specific techniques would be very useful. As someone that's only in the past few months become a little more aware of the different techniques. It was not used during medical school, and I can only picture now how difficult some of that would have been. Like maybe trying to use linking for biochemical pathways or something along those lines. But also the terminology for every different discipline in med school is quite difficult to associate certain topics with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and it was a challenge to figure things out. And we can get into all those kind of specifics if you'd like.
Sure. As many specifics as you're willing to go into, I'm sure the audience would be greatly appreciative.
Yeah. So, I mean, so the basic technique that we kind of built the site around is something called the memory palace technique. So essentially just to kind of start at the most basic level, what you're doing with memory techniques just generally, is you want to take whatever you want to memorize or learn and turn it into some kind of mental picture. And so the picture represents that information, and that is helpful because, pictures are just much more easily remembered by the brain than, kind of random facts or words or things like that. So the goal is kind of get everything into some sort of representative picture. And then, where the memory palace comes in is that you imagine some sort of physical space that you're familiar with. So it could be your the house you grew up in, the house you live now, any kind of residences that you've had. It could be college campus, your med school campus, basically any space that you're familiar with. And you try to think of some sort of path, a mental journey through that place. And then so as you learn, material, you can turn that information into images and then kind of deposit those images along that mental path in the memory palace. And so it works because, one, like I said, humans' visual memory is very strong. And so those pictures kind of tend to stick with you a little bit better than they would otherwise. And then also people's navigational memory and spatial memory is super strong as well. So, you're able to kind of remember those routes through these memory palaces very easily. And then also, having the memory palace kind of in the background for the images provides an extra hook or an extra cue that kind of helps you, hold on to that information as well.
I think one thing that med students often relate to when we kind of bring up this spatial, the strength of the spatial memory is we'll tell people, your spatial memory is really strong. It's really instinctive. And people say, oh yeah, like that makes sense, because a lot of times when I'm taking a test and I'm trying to remember something, I can remember exactly where it was on the paper. I just can't remember what the words were. So I think that really resonates with people.
Right. People definitely remember, where things are in their notes and things like that. So one of the projects that we worked on through the nonprofit Mullen Memory is we wrote a section for first aid for the USMLE Step 1 called Learning Strategies. And so we worked with this guy, Tao Lee, who's the head editor of first aid. And he said that pretty much the most common complaint that people submit to him every year, why did you change the look of the diagram, or why did you move, this diagram from this page to that page? Like I had it all, I had the spatial layout of the page memorized. So that's, those kind of spatial connections are really, really strong with people. And I think that definitely speaks to kind of why memory palaces are effective. Yeah. So, that's the memory palace technique is sort of the basic technique that we, like I said, we built the site around.
First, I think that is very, very true. I still remember if something was written on the left side of the page or right side of the page in my personal notes. So I can definitely see how having certain images in certain locations can be extremely beneficial to the memory when studying, especially if you're already overtaxed.
Yeah. So we try to just think about the memory palace technique as sort of just a better version of kind of having notes, the spatial arrangement of your notes on a page, just a little bit more powerful version of that. So, if I could just try to condense, I talked about the roadblocks that we kind of ran into. I'll try to condense our kind of primary tips for dealing with those roadblocks into 3 points. So one of them is definitely that when I started doing this, and both of us, this goes for both of us, we were making way too many images. I mentioned, you take the information, you turn it into some kind of mental picture. You really don't want to be doing that with every single thing you learn, and that's what I tried to do at the beginning, is just take everything that I was learning, turn it into pictures. And it quickly got very, very overwhelming. And then, you realize that, once you're a week or two into learning the material, a lot of those original images that you made are kind of useless to you because you already kind of understand the material, on a somewhat intuitive level. And so a lot of those images aren't that helpful. And so you end up having this big sea of images, only about, a few of which are actually useful to you, and the rest you just sort of understand. So that was one of the key, things that we've changed moving forward, is that we really try to be very selective about what information we turn into images. A lot of stuff we read it and we watch a video about it, we understand it, we don't make anything for it. But for those kind of more unintuitive, hard to remember details, those are the kind of things that we do create mental pictures for and place them in memory palaces. And so just to give an example of that, a lot of things, for instance, in microbiology or in pharmacology, these are things that tend to be kind of unintuitive and hard to remember. The names of drugs or the side effects of drugs, they don't always explain those very well, or, what kind of properties different bacteria have. These are all kind of unintuitive things that memory techniques tend to be helpful for. So that's the primary one, is just not over making images. Another one involves kind of the creation of memory palaces. And a lot of people think that memory palaces, and I felt this way myself for a while, that they take a lot of time to set up, and it's like, well, why am I going to spend all this extra time trying to go around and think of memory palaces and create memory palaces? That's just going to add a lot of, time to my overall study time. And the way that we try to minimize that barrier of spending time making palaces is really just to, we have basically a brainstormed set of palace ideas that we kind of add to periodically.
Like location.
Right. So, I have a spreadsheet where I've written down, hundreds of possible palaces, like my house, my parents' house, my brother's apartment, this restaurant, that restaurant. And I just had this kind of list of all these different places that I could use potentially as palaces. And then when I pick something that I want to learn and use a palace for, I'll just go to that sheet, pick it. I haven't done any work, in terms of choosing locations or creating a journey for that particular place yet, but I'll just choose the locations that I'm going to store images as I'm learning the material. So, in that way, you're not really actually spending a whole lot of extra time creating the palace. You just sort of create the palace as you go.
As he's walking through the location, he's dropping images as he walks along, basically.
Right. Well, and so I'll say, okay, I want to devote, I want to have a couple images for bacteria X. And so I'll choose a room, in that palace that I've chosen, and then just pick a couple spots right there only for those images that I just created. So that kind of hopefully, lowers that barrier. The last thing, the third thing is basically starting to use some of these general learning strategies that I mentioned. So two of them that are probably the most validated and supported by learning science are called retrieval practice and spacing. So retrieval practice basically just means that when you review material, instead of just going back and rereading it, really try to actively test yourself on it, try to actively recall it and bring it to memory rather than just rereading it. So that's something that I always try to do when I'm reviewing material is I try to actively recall it instead of just reread it. And that actually kind of boosts the long-term retention of that material more than it otherwise would. And then you combine that with spacing, which essentially is spreading your learning and review of material out over time, rather than cramming it all quickly. So, med students and, the way that medical schools are set up is, encourages this, are, have a tendency to cram. They have a test coming up. They spend, a couple of days just like cramming, this anatomy or that anatomy. And then they just sort of forget it and they don't come back to it. And that's really a recipe that really kind of destroys your long-term retention. So what we do is we try to, space our learning out over time, and we'll review something, day after we learn it. And then, a couple days after that, or a week or 2 weeks after that, and then kind of spread it out, further into the future so that we're always kind of coming back to old material and, kind of combining that with retrieval practice, like I said. When we review that material, we don't just reread it, we try to recall it actively. So, that's something that we do both for just material that we learn, but also for, the material that we do turn into memory palace images. We try to recall those memory palace images actively and then review them over time periodically, spaced out over time. Those kind of combination of things, making fewer images, making the palaces as you go, and then using retrieval practice and spacing really kind of helped eliminate all the roadblocks that we ran into using these techniques for school. It makes things last longer over time. It doesn't add a whole lot of extra time to your studying. And it really kind of, not making a lot of images really kind of protects you from just relying on brute force memorization to get through all the material. So I know that was a super long-winded answer, but hopefully that kind of covers all the primary ground in terms of, the things that we kind of learn in the process of using these techniques and how to do them effectively for med school.
Oh, that was a great answer. Very thorough and covering some of the main topics that I actually was going to bring up later. So perfect. And basically covered all of my study habits, not the good ones, all the mistakes you mentioned. But so if I could relate making too many images to maybe over highlighting in a textbook or in your notes, does that sound sort of adequate?
Yeah, there's definitely like an analogy there. Yeah.
I'd say between that and definitely the failure to do proper spaced repetition, that seems to be the hardest thing. It was the hardest thing for me to get in the habit of doing, and seems to still be a very difficult thing for most medical students to do, just the time requirements or the discipline to do so. I can definitely see how images would actually be a lot quicker to recall in your memory than going through pages and pages of notes or textbook.
Yeah, and one of the primary tools that we use to do this retrieval practice and spacing, you can call that together spaced retrieval practice is the kind of common term for it. One of the ways that we do spaced retrieval practice is we use a program called Anki, which is becoming more and more popular among med students especially. So we basically, when we take notes, we use Anki, which is just it's essentially a flashcard program on your computer. You'll just write a question onto one side, and then and that question could be like, explain the pathogenesis of heart failure or something like that. And then you'll write the answer on the other side. And then the way that it'll work is that it will bring those cards back to you over time in a spaced out way. So, you'll put that card into Anki, and then the next day you'll see it and it'll say, explain the pathogenesis of heart failure. And you'll have to, actively retrieve that information using retrieval practice. And then when you say that that card, it will put it away for a little while, and then it'll bring it back to you in, say, a week or 2 weeks after that, over time as you, continue to answer it correctly. And so it really kind of does all the heavy lifting for you in terms of scheduling your reviews and, doing the retrieval practice aspect of it. It kind of does all the hard work for you. So that's what we do. is using Anki to help us do that space retrieval practice. And we'll just write our mnemonics into our Anki cards. That's how we kind of keep track of those as well.
I'm very familiar with Anki, used it a lot during medical school, especially the basic sciences anyway. I guess it would be a little more difficult in the clinical sciences, second 2 years. The last interview I had on the show was actually very specific about certain ways that he organizes flashcards that we found very effective and information dense. So that would be an interesting one for anyone in the audience to go back and check. Have you been thinking about one-on-one training and tutoring at a reasonable price? Well, Prospective Doctor is now sponsoring a limited number of free sessions with me each month. To register, you can go to prospectivedoctor.com/chase and register for a free 30-minute coaching session. If you decide that you want to use their MCAT or USMLE tutoring services, you can now use the code CHASE10 to receive 10% off of your first $400 spent. Just enter CHASE10 and get your discount now.
The Medical Mnemonist podcast is powered by Med School Coach. To access Med School Coach services, including USMLE tutoring and residency admissions advising, visit our website at medschoolcoach.com. Good luck as you prepare for your board exams, and we hope you tune in again next time.